Hi, this is Emma DiMaggio, Communications Manager at the Golden Rain Foundation. You're listening to Leisure World Direct, a podcast covering all things Golden Rain Foundation. I'm here with Executive Director Jessica Sedgwick and Executive Manager Dave Potter. Hi, guys.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Today's topic of discussion is the budget, which has just passed in the last 48 hours. How are we feeling?
Relieved that it's done.
I echo that. Very relieved that we got it passed.
I know that it's been passed now and it's set in stone, but I think that some people are still interested in the process and how the budget actually comes together, so that'll be the topic today. First of all, could you explain to me why GRF has a budget and what its purpose is?
Well, GRF is, at the end of the day, a common interest development, and common interest developments are required to have a budget to lay out here's what our spending forecast is for the year for the foundation. And then based on that spending forecast for the year, you can calculate out what is the monthly assessment that's going to be due from all of the members of that common interest development. Now, GRF is a bit different from the mutuals, just in that if you look at a mutual budget, you will see that something like 98 or 99% of their income comes from assessments. They get a very small amount comparative to their annual budget from other revenue sources. GRF is very fortunate or blessed in that actually a large segment of its revenue comes from other sources. In the 2025 budget that was just approved, it will be about 33%, almost exactly 1/3, will come from non-assessment income. And that, in turn, keeps that monthly assessment lower than what it would normally be to cover the full cost of running the foundation.
Tell me a little bit about what sort of line items are in a budget that helps manage this community.
I mean, any expense that the foundation makes, whether it's, buying donuts for a board meeting or buying parts for repairs to a toilet or a sink in a mutual unit or paying for a band at the amphitheater show, every single expense gets assigned to a general ledger line item in the budget, and then we can measure what we spend in the year against that budget forecast, right? Well, we know that we have budgeted X amount of dollars for amphitheater shows, and as we go through an amphitheater season and we pay the bands out, those checks all get individually assigned to that GL, and at the end of the amphitheater season, we're either right on target, or we're over it, or we're under it. And then we have to explain why we were either over or under if that's what happened for that line.
And you say GL, that's a general ledger code.
Yes.
Yes, we like to reference everything with a general ledger code. And just to touch a little bit more on the budget, I like to equate it. Sometimes it's easier to reference to your own personal checkbook or your own personal budget as you do. So how when you are bringing in money every month and then you have different lines for certain bills you have to pay, certain discretionary expenses, required expenses, repair and maintenance, it's the same thing that we do with the Golden Rain Foundation with the budget. We have the funds that come in and then we budget against different lines and the different bills essentially that we have to pay.
How big is GRF's annual checkbook balance, if you will, or budget?
The budget that was just approved is over $27 million for the year.
Is that normal for a community of this size? Or I know that Leisure World's a little bit different from an HOA or something like that.
I was going to say normal is unfortunately a subjective or relative term in common interest development land. So even for a community of this size, I would say that that's probably a larger number than you will find, simply because the Golden Rain Foundation, through its management agreements, it maintains the mutual property. The mutuals pay Golden Rain Foundation to have a on-site maintenance crew that can handle virtually all the repairs that are needed to maintain the building. In most typical HOAs, that stuff is outsourced. It's not a direct employment line. So by virtue of having all the security here on site, by virtue of having that maintenance crew also on site and available to go, that does make the expenditure a little more, but I think it also provides a more personalized and higher level of service because these are now direct employees working here as opposed to a third party.
Seems like there's just more money in the pot coming in and out, which makes the budget bigger and probably also your income larger.
Yes, exactly. We offer a lot of services here that you don't see in a typical HOA. We're very service heavy in Leisure World, and you do see that a little bit more with these bigger master planned, especially when the age restricted communities. You start to see a lot more services that are offered. You see the security, you tend to have gated communities. We also have our transportation within the community, which is not a typical thing that you see in a lot of communities. It's a kind of a more of a rare thing to see actually with the robust transportation that we have, which is a great service that we offer here. And so we have all of those services that really add and do end up making our budget a little bit more labor heavy than other typical HOAs are going to be. But this is the community that we are in. We want to offer those services. We also have member resources to help because we're age restricted, and because with age restricted communities there comes different issues and things that pop up that you don't see in other communities that we are trying to address.
How much does the larger pie, if you break it up into households, how much does it cost, the assessment per month?
Well, if you break it up by mutual, I actually haven't done all the math on that yet. The mutuals approved all of their budgets about, the last one came in about 5 days before the Golden Rain Foundation approved theirs. And I haven't put together a cheat sheet or chart for the client services team and the finance team to reference when they're talking with shareholders yet. But it will vary a lot. I think the lowest assessment rate is still maybe right around $250 for one of the mutuals, and I think the highest assessment rate is maybe $390 depending on the mutual. So it's going to vary a lot, but I will say that even if you total up the assessment rate for the mutual with the assessment rate from the Golden Rain Foundation with your taxes and your OC user fee, you're still paying less than you would to rent an apartment in virtually any instance in the city of Seal Beach, or I think in any of the surrounding communities.
I know that it's not a quick in and out. I know that you collect the assessments, but not all of that money immediately goes to something that's going to be paid for in the next couple of months. Can you kind of explain to me the different buckets where the money in the budget goes?
Sure. So there are basically 3 funds that the foundation has, 3 buckets, if you will. There's an operating fund, there is a capital fund, and there is a reserve fund. And the income, and I'm going to use the word income as opposed to assessments. So the income that's collected in most years will be divided between those 3 buckets. Now, this upcoming year is a little different because of a variety of circumstances that are all created by the substantial rise in insurance prices. The foundation is not going to be contributing to the capital budget, the capital bucket, in 2025. They are redirecting those funds elsewhere for 2025, and hopefully that will only be for that year. So all the money will be going into either the operating budget or the reserve budget. Now, the operating fund is used for your day-to-day expenses. Basically, as a good rule of thumb, if you spend money on something at least once a year, so like your landscaping maintenance contract where you pay somebody every month, or payroll for the staff on the foundation, which happens 2 to 3 times a month, depending on the month you're in, or paying your CPA firm, which you do maybe once a year. Those types of expenses are all paid out of your operating budget. If you have an expense that's going to happen less frequently than that, and those types of expenses are generally limited to a major repair or a flat-out component replacement, those are paid for out of your reserve fund. The reserve fund gets money because when you pass an operating budget, you say, we're going to contribute X amount of dollars every month into that reserve fund. so that we have all the money that we need to do these major repairs or component replacements when the time comes.
Can you explain a little bit more about the capital budget and what that pays for?
I can. I was watching you and I could tell you had a follow-up question.
Yeah.
You were just trying to think of how to craft it. So the capital fund, that bucket of money exists and is funded so that when the foundation needs to do something that is an improvement or an upgrade over something that's existing that maybe they didn't have before. An example I can use is maybe the key card system that we use to help secure some of the employee buildings and areas so that employees have ready access, nobody else does, and we as employers have the ability to quickly control if an employee or a now former employee no longer has access there. Installing items like that, that's typically a capital fund expense because it's not something that exists right now, and you're kind of upgrading and bringing things into the 21st century of how things are done. Society is moving away from keys and locks for commercial areas, such as an employer like the Golden Rain Foundation. That's something that you would use capital fund money on.
If there's no capital money for this upcoming year, I think people's impression is that we won't be seeing any upgrades around the community. Can you dispel that?
We'll dispel it a little. You first.
A little
Jessica.
bit. So, dispelling it a little bit, we still have a capital fund and it still has money in it. What we're not doing is adding any additional money for 2025. We've redirected those funds to our operating contingency for a variety of reasons. So we are not going to be increasing the capital fund. Now, because we're not going to be increasing it, we don't have funds that are flowing into it. We do have to be selective and particular about what we're going to spend those capital funds on. So yes, where someone may say, hey, we want to add 10 more pickleball courts because pickleball has gotten really, really big. That's probably not something that's going to be done in the next year. But if we find there's anything that we needed to add for life, safety, risk management, liability reduction, we are going to have some funds in there that we will be able to use. So the money that's already in there, it's not going away. The money stays there. We are just not going to be increasing the amount that's in there, at least for 2025.
Can you explain some projects on the horizon that you think that you will be spending money on, maybe from the contingency fund or from the capital funds?
We're not going to be spending any money from the contingency fund. That's the operating contingency is going to be built up a bit over 2025 to try to ensure that we have cash on hand to make our the down payment that's needed for the insurance policy renewals every year. That down payment has grown substantially with the rise in insurance prices. I anticipate that down payment will be around 1.2 or 1.3 million in the month of December for this year, which is an unbudgeted expense. We have budgeted for it in 2025, so hopefully we will have some cash on hand to do it, and then we need to build up that operating contingency so that we have the cash flow and the cash on hand so that it's not a reactive funding. It's not that we're spending it and then replenishing it, taking the account basically down to zero. We want to build it up so that we have the enough excess there so that we don't have to deplete it and therefore put some strain on the foundation's operations throughout the rest of the year where we might need that contingency for other purposes. Mm-hmm. I'll let Jessica answer the fun question about what we might do for capital, though, next year.
So as of right now, there are no projects on the horizon, nothing that's been talked about in committee. There may be a couple of ideas percolating, but nothing's really risen up to anything concrete at this time. I think the focus really is just going to be on safety, life, risk management. We may be looking at something to do with something new that we could potentially do with the pedestrian gates. That's kind of come up as a source of some issues that we need to address. But at this time, it hasn't been fully talked about or even started a conversation on in any of the committees for capital funds.
I do have a follow-up. I know that you're explaining where all of the money is going, into what funds and how it's going to be used and what you're planning for. Who makes or who contributes to all of these planning decisions? Someone's deciding that a certain amount is going into contingency, someone's deciding how much each department needs. Can you explain what that, from inception to passage, what that looks like?
Talk a little bit about the whole process that we went through.
Yeah, so it was a very long process. I think some people think, oh, this is a month, we slap it together, here we go. This is really kind of I want to say almost like a 6-month long process, really, when we get started, because we start kind of the beginning of the year to get a cost to complete our reserve study. So we start with the reserve study. So that's the first step in doing a budget, is updating our reserve study. So we start that. We start getting that updated, and there's a process that we go through with the reserve analyst and getting them documentation and data on everything that we have spent, what's being planned on being spent out of the reserve, so that they can come in and update that document.
Can you explain really quickly in layman's terms what the reserve study is?
So the reserve study is essentially our guide map, if you will. And I think we're going to go over a little bit in our next episode to talk about the reserve study. So if you want more information on that, make sure to stay tuned for our next episode. But typically it's our guide map over the next 30 years on major repairs and replacements.
Okay, thank you. So next step after the reserve study.
So with the reserve study ideally in hand, we start the budget process at the staff level, and we do a month-long kind of individual departmental review of the budget for whatever the current fiscal year is at the time, looking ahead to what do we need to do for the next year. After we complete the first month of that, we get together in a staff meeting, look at all of it together, see what the result is, and then everybody goes back to their own individual collective corners and tries to refine that. We kind of poke holes in what everybody is doing as a collective group. Everyone goes back, comes back with more refined numbers. We do a final pass at the full department head level as a group and come up with what staff's initial recommendation is for a budget for the foundation. At that point, we turn it over to the committees. So each committee has an area of budget that they have jurisdiction over. And we start presenting to that committee their area that they have jurisdiction over, as was put together by staff, and we let the committee as a whole start poking and prodding and making suggestions and edits, and they inevitably find things because we're all human beings and we have to work together as a team. After we do a round of that for a month, we did a work study with the board to show them here's kind of roughly where it's at, and then the committees all spent a month taking another crack at it and another pass at it and refining it some more. And then we got to the point where we made our initial presentation at a special board meeting to pass the budget that had been worked on by staff for 2 months and had been worked on by the committees for 2 months at that point. And the board was, for anybody who was watching, was unable to reach a consensus in that first meeting. We had to continue the meeting. That gave us the opportunity to make a couple of other refinements because everything's always changing. And I think I told Jessica yesterday, I'm just so relieved that now whenever something happens, my first instinct is not to run to the budget worksheet and have to make a financial change on something. Because now it's locked for better or worse, and whatever happens is going to happen. But because it didn't pass, we had the opportunity to make some refinements, and we were able to make some additional changes. And with that, the board was able to reach a consensus on October 30th and pass the budget. I believe the final vote was 13-5, which is a pretty resounding majority vote.
I want to point out as well that the committees are made up of board members.
Yes.
Correct? So
that is correct.
Residents are reviewing the budget elected residents are reviewing the budget at the committee level, poking holes in it. Then the board as a whole reviews, and then it goes back to the elected residents. So they have a substantial role, it seems, in shaping the budget as well.
100%. At the end of the day, staff can make suggestions, we can make recommendations, but at the end of the day, the board is the entity that has the power to approve the budget and the spending plan, and now staff's role is to go forth and to implement that spending plan.
And how, I know that the process is now done, but you guys also you and board members took resident input into consideration as well. I know that some residents aren't elected, but there was a process where they could give feedback via public comments or emails.
Yes. So throughout this entire process of doing the budget, especially when we get to the committee level, a lot of these discussions happened in open meetings where shareholders were welcome to come in and speak during the member comment period, to submit in emails and anything like that to the committees. So the first shot was, here you go, look at the committees. You can submit your input on that committee's portion of the budget to potentially be taken into consideration as the committees are deliberating on their portion of the budget. Then once it was out of committee and to the board, then again, residents had the opportunity to send in an email ahead of time and also to speak at the board meeting regarding their input on the budget as well.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that it's directors and staff and also our board kind of shaping this discussion. Obviously, they were able to shape it in some way since it did not pass the first time, and you guys did another pass and it was approved.
Yes.
What happens now as we move forward?
Now we're into the production process. So now we have an approved budget, and that's great. And the board's part of this is done. Staff's part isn't done yet, though, because Civil Code requires that the budget be mailed in a specific legal notice fashion to all of the impacted members who are going to be paying the assessment rate. So that's what myself and my team are going to be working on very busily over the next couple of weeks to make sure that that packet gets completed and mailed out to everybody with a postmark no later than November 30th so that we're complying with Civil Code requirements.
Very fun.
Yes, so my panic is not yet done.
Yeah, people will be eagerly awaiting their copies. Is there anything else that you think is important for people to understand about this budget season, or any information that they can maybe carry with them for future budget seasons?
I want to say the board took their job very seriously. There was a lot of review done on this budget. I know a lot of times it seems out in the community that there's maybe not as much discussion going on, but there's a lot of discussion that goes on. Each committee reviewed line by line of the budget for their section and discussed about pretty much every single line in there on what this funding was, what this was. There were a lot of factors and hard decisions that they had to make. There's a lot of outside forces that they just couldn't control. We've talked about, briefly mentioned the insurance. There's also the potential minimum wage increase. We'll see. There's the proposition that's up. So we're 48 hours out of the budget approval, but we're right before the November, 5th, next week's election, where there is a very important Proposition 32 that's talking about minimum wage going up to $18 an hour. And that doesn't just affect our staffing here. That's obvious. That's the obvious one. It'll affect our staffing here, but it affects every other service that we get. So the janitorial, the landscaping contracts, any of those contracts, as increase in minimum wage is going to have a big impact on what those costs are going to be. But the board really looks at all those decisions. They look at the staffing, they look at the insurance, they look at all the different things that we offer, they look at the services, and their goal as the board is to make sure that they're maintaining the community and they're maintaining the services that we're here to offer and that the residents have come to know and why they move into this community in the first place.
I think a point that Jessica just said there really resonates with me, which is that there are a lot of pressures and factors that this board, and really any board, does not have any control over. And chief among them this year was the spike in insurance prices that we saw right at the end of last year. If you look at the budget as a whole and you take all of the insurance-related increases in costs out, the increase year over year for everything else was right about 2%, which is actually below the rate of inflation in 2024 for this region. The Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim area is at about 4.1% for inflation. Now, with all the insurance factored in, it was a little over 10% overall as an increase in the budget, which, yes, that's a substantial increase, particularly if you're on a fixed income. I am not blind to that. But there's nothing that anyone can do to control the rising cost of insurance, unfortunately. And that is a necessary spend. It's not a discretionary item. The thing that I am hopeful about is that in this budget, we had to make up for 2 years worth of it, right? Last year's budget, we didn't anticipate the increase. So for this year, we are not only playing catch up for what we didn't budget in 2024, but we're also trying to anticipate what that increase is going to be for 2025. So we're really doing 2 years worth of substantial hikes in the same budget. My hope is that even if the insurance market isn't calmed down yet by the time we're doing this again in 12 months, that because we're doing a single year, if our fiscal position is improved, we're not going to be looking at something like we were this year.
Great. I hope everyone listens to our next episode. If you did not understand the reserve study conversation, we'll be delving deeper into that. Thank you. This has been Leisure World Direct.